I'm James Turk. I'm a director of the Gold Money Foundation, and I'm here today with Jim Rickards, Senior Managing Director of Tangent Capital. Jim, a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.
We're here at the GATA conference. There's a news announcement just out that the European Central Bank is intervening in the market to buy Italian bonds. What's your reaction?
Well, it's really sort of, I call it sequential hostage taking by the markets. We saw it starting in Greece and then Ireland and Portugal and Italy. And the problem for Europe, every time they bail out one of these economies or come up with some arrangement or bond exchange or extended maturity, there are different techniques for doing it. But every time they put out one fire, they assume that the whole thing is over, that they've sent a message to the markets that they're going to do this, they're going to keep the euro together and prop up these sovereign borrowers, and so the markets should relax. But the markets don't relax. What they do is they say, well, thank you very much for buying our Greek bonds. Now we're going to up the ante and we're going to attack Italy and force you to buy our Italian bonds. I think what's going on, James, is that the markets are basically trying to force the sovereigns to lift their positions. Obviously they take a loss, but if it's 70 or 80 cents on the dollar, that's a lot better than what the market might bear, which might be down 50 or even 40 cents on the dollar. So it's as if the markets and the banks are forcing the governments to lift their positions one by one. What's going to happen in the end game is that the ECB and the European Stabilization Fund are going to own all the sovereign bonds in Europe. They will owe themselves money, and then it's not clear where it goes from there. You either unload that on the taxpayers directly, or you inflate the currency and, in effect, steal from your own citizens. So it's going to have a bad ending, but it'll play out over years. What
is it that the politicians don't recognize and that the market recognizes? Are they just being poorly advised, or do they have something in their mind that is taking them in a direction completely opposite of what the market's looking at?
It's a really good question. I think it's a number of factors. Some of it's just wishful thinking. Look, what does it take to be a successful politician? Well, probably not the same thing it takes to be a PhD economist or a capital markets expert. So they get into these positions and don't really have any background in economics necessarily. Some of them do, of course, but not a lot of them. Then they get advisors, but the advisors sort of adhere to the conventional wisdom. Then there's sort of short-termism. Well, just get me through the next election cycle. I don't really care that much about what's going to happen in 5 years or 10 years. Then there's some wishful thinking, just hoping for the best without really being rigorous or analytical about that. So there are a number of factors that come into play, but I think you're right that what's not happening is people are not confronting the problem candidly, honestly, the way they should. And perhaps some of those who are not willing to talk about it. Certainly our central bankers are not going to come out and say, well, sorry, the country's broke, but that's the reality in some of these cases.
How did the European Central Bank become a hostage of politicians? Because, the EU rules were set up that it was going to be independent like the Bundesbank and that the euro would not be involved with political influence, so it would be managed like the Deutsche Mark. But, the euro is obviously being politically influenced, and the ECB is being, I think, politically influenced as well by politicians. How did this evolve?
Well, again, a good question. I think there are two answers to it. One goes back 60 years, which is the euro has always been primarily a political project. It is an economic project. It's a monetary project, of course, but it's always been a political project. It's been about avoiding war in Europe. I mean, you take the long view. Go back to the Counter-Reformation in the mid-16th century. You had a bloody Counter-Reformation. You had the Napoleonic Wars, the Wars of Louis XIV, the 7 Years' War, the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, World War II, the Holocaust. By the time European civilization got to the late 40s and early 50s, they were literally exhausted. I mean, they'd been fighting for 400 years. So they said, well, this is crazy, and it's just going to happen again. So we have to find some way to prevent it. So their theory was economic integration would be the antidote to political disintegration and warfare. So that's the big picture view of Europe, starting with France and Germany as the core and extending outward from there. So that's sort of one aspect to it. So there's a very strong historical and political dimension to this, that the leaders do not want the euro to fall apart. They do, of course it would make sense for Greece to leave the euro, go back to the drachma, devalue their currency. I remember going to Greece decades ago, and I couldn't spend $100 a day. I'd stay in the best hotel, eat in great restaurants, take taxis, go shopping, and I couldn't spend $100 a day. And that's always been Greece's solution, encourage tourism, encourage exports, et cetera. Well, they can't do that anymore. But so there's some logic to leaving the euro, but Europe does not want them to. They don't want anyone to leave because they've accomplished some of their goals. But the other aspect of it really is more purely economic, which Germany gets enormous advantage from being part of the euro, because in effect, the rest of Europe is not competitive with Germany. So Germany has always been able to export very heavily, even in a strong currency environment. You go back to the Deutschmark in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. The Deutschmark went up significantly against the dollar, and yet Germany was still an export powerhouse because they're efficient, because their technology, because labor and business management work together. So they have an ability to power through an appreciating currency. The rest of Europe doesn't, but that's okay with Germany because they have captive markets. You know, Italy's not going to start a company like Siemens. Greece is not going to start an aircraft company. So they sort of have the best of both worlds. So I think for political and economic reasons that Germany is willing to subsidize Europe and does not want the euro to break up.